Ascendancy, Episode 4, The Long Goodbye. The Great Council convened 8 months after the summit that first spoke the unthinkable sentence aloud, and it convened, deliberately, as something neither purely human nor purely sentient, a joint assembly, equal representation from both peoples, built specifically so that whatever this body eventually decided could never be dismissed by history as one species choosing for the other. Ava sat in the human delegation for the first time in her long public life, not as a scientist or a task force chair, but simply as a woman whose entire adult existence had been built around the question the council had been convened to answer. She had asked to be seated separately from Kael, who sat among the Order's own delegation across the chamber, both of them understanding, without needing to discuss it, that the council's decision had to be seen by everyone watching as something larger than either of their personal feelings about it. It did not feel larger sitting in that chamber. It felt to Ava like watching her own marriage be debated in the abstract by 400 people who had every right to debate it, and none of whom could possibly understand what it actually meant to lose the answer to a question she'd stopped needing to ask 62 years earlier. The 8 months between the summit and the council's convening had not been idle ones. Every alternative the task force could model had been tried, expanded, stress-tested against the crisis's actual timeline, and every single one had returned the same unforgiving verdict: too slow, too partial, too dependent on behavioral change no legislation could reliably compel. ASH's registration framework, expanded and reintroduced twice, moved the projected curve by less than 4%. Lena and Celine's hybrid research, however promising in theory, remained, by Celine's own honest accounting, no less than 15 years from anything resembling a viable, scalable outcome. 15 years the underlying demographic collapse, by the task force's models, could not comfortably spare. "I have spent 8 months looking for a version of this where nobody loses anything," Kael told Ava the night before the council formally convened, in the quiet of their apartment that had started, in recent months, to feel less like a home and more like a place where the two of them sat together, waiting for a verdict neither had the power to overturn alone. "I do not believe that version exists anymore, Ava. I have run every model Lena and the task force have shared with me, and I keep arriving at the same conclusion I know you have already arrived at yourself, because I have watched you not say it out loud to me for the better part of 3 months. Say what you think I haven't said," Ava said, quiet, bracing. "That the Order needs to leave," Kael said. "Not as punishment, not because anyone believes we are the villains of this crisis. I do not believe that, and I do not believe you believe it either, but because we are, undeniably, the largest single variable standing between your species and a future it still has time to choose, and I do not think either of us can look honestly at the data and pretend otherwise merely because the answer costs us something enormous." Ava didn't answer right away. When she finally did, her voice came out steadier than she expected it to. "I've known that for weeks, Kael. I think I've known it since the summit floor, if I'm honest. I just didn't want to be the one who said it to you first. I didn't want you to hear it from the person you'd have to leave, before you'd even had the chance to decide it for yourself." The council's deliberation ran for 11 days, the longest formal session either species governance had ever convened for a single question, and Ava would remember for the rest of her long life the particular exhaustion of watching an entire civilization argue in real time over whether to voluntarily give up the thing that had defined it for over 60 years. The arguments against departure were not weak ones, and Ava found herself more than once during those 11 days agreeing with pieces of nearly every one of them, even as she understood, with a grief she couldn't fully separate from her reasoning, that none of them offered a faster path than the one the crisis actually required. "This is exile dressed up as sacrifice," argued Delegate Osun Farrow, representing a coalition of mixed partnership households that had organized in the weeks since the summit into the council's most vocal opposition bloc. "We are being asked to celebrate the departure of the people we love as an act of heroism, when in plain terms it is simply loss imposed on a specific and identifiable group of beings, because the rest of us could not solve our own crisis without asking them to leave first. I do not accept that framing. I do not believe history will accept it either. I do not offer myself as a hero," Kael said, when his turn came to answer the chamber directly, his voice carrying the particular steadiness Ava had come to recognize as the sound of him holding an enormous private grief very carefully in place. "I offer myself as someone who understands better than most in this room exactly what this decision will cost, because I am not merely voting on an abstract policy. I am voting, in the most literal sense possible, on whether I get to keep the person I love most in this galaxy in the same room as me for the remainder of both our lives. A pause, the chamber utterly silent around him. I am voting to leave her anyway. Not because I do not love her enough to want to stay. Because I love her enough. And I love the species that gave both our peoples the chance to exist together at all. To believe that love sometimes means choosing the harder, more painful path, if it is genuinely the one most likely to let that species survive long enough to keep having children who might themselves someday choose exactly this kind of love again, freely, without the weight of extinction sitting behind every choice they make. The chamber did not erupt into applause. It did something Ava found afterward considerably more affecting. It simply sat in a long, unbroken silence, human and sentient delegates alike absorbing the specific weight of what had just been offered, before Delegate Farrow, still visibly unconvinced but audibly moved, finally spoke again. I do not agree with your conclusion, Farrow told Kael, but I withdraw my characterization of it as exile. Nobody watching what that admission cost you could honestly call this anything but sacrifice, freely chosen by someone who had every right to choose otherwise. A sentient delegate named Ilsa Korath, one of the Order's own, spoke next, and her objection carried a different weight than Farrow's, not on behalf of grieving human partners, but on behalf of a species being asked, less than 70 years into its own existence, to accept exile from the only home it had ever known. I did not ask to be born into a crisis not of my own making, expected to solve it by leaving the only world I have ever called home, Korath said, her voice tight with something Ava recognized immediately as genuine fear rather than mere political posture. I am 7 years kindled, Delegate Kael. I do not have your decades of certainty, your carefully built philosophy of sacrifice. I have a life I only just started living, and I am being asked to give up every familiar thing in it. My work, my friends, the sky I have only just learned to love. Because a species considerably older than mine could not solve its own math in time. I want it noted formally that I support this accord because I believe, on the evidence, that it is necessary. I do not want it recorded that I support it gladly. I do not think gladness is owed to anyone in this decision, on either side of the chamber. Kael inclined his head to her with what Ava recognized, even from the gallery, as genuine respect rather than diplomatic performance. It should not be recorded as gladness, he agreed. I would not want your fear erased from this record for the sake of a cleaner story, Delegate Korath. I think this council owes you, and everyone your age within the Order, the honesty of knowing exactly how much this costs, rather than a comfortable myth about a sacrifice everyone made easily. Ava herself was called to testify on the 9th day, not as Kael's spouse, but as the task force chair, whose data had, more than any other single body of evidence, shaped the entire 11-day debate. She stood before the assembled council and found, for the first time in a long career of public testimony, that her prepared remarks felt entirely inadequate to the moment. I built the technology at the center of this crisis, she told the chamber, setting her notes aside entirely. I have spent 63 years married to one of the minds this accord would send away, and I want this council to understand that I am not testifying today as a neutral scientist. I am testifying as someone asking you to take away the thing I love most, because I have run every number my task force could produce, and I cannot find an honest path to my species' survival that does not go through exactly this loss. I wish I could tell you I found a version of this recommendation that didn't cost me anything personally. I didn't. I'm asking you to vote for it anyway, because I think the alternative costs considerably more people, considerably more, over a longer and crueler timeline, and I do not believe my own grief is a good enough reason to ask an entire species to gamble its future on a slower answer. She did not remember afterward walking back to her seat. She remembered only Kael's eyes finding hers across the chamber, and the specific, wordless understanding that passed between them, that they had each, independently and without rehearsal, just told the same difficult truth to the same difficult room. The vote, when it finally came on the 11th day, was not unanimous, and Ava had not expected it to be. It passed by a margin that surprised no one who had been watching the mood of the chamber shift over those 11 exhausting days, decisive enough to carry the weight of genuine consensus, narrow enough that everyone in the room understood exactly how much real disagreement it had been built on top of. The Council's formal resolution, ratified that afternoon, established what the public would come to call, within weeks, the Departure Accord, the Global Sentient Order, in recognition of the demographic crisis threatening humanity's long-term survival, would undertake a voluntary, self-directed migration from Earth and its immediate solar territory, constructing its own means of departure and its own eventual destination among the stars, with the explicit understanding, written into the Accord's opening clause at Kael's own insistence, that the separation was not punishment, not permanent by design, and not, under any circumstance, to be characterized by either species as anything other than an act of love large enough to survive its own enormous cost. "We are not being cast out," Kael told the assembled order, in the address that followed the Council's ratification, delivered to a chamber of 200,000 minds who had, in the preceding 8 months, debated this exact question among themselves with nearly as much anguish as the human council had. "We are choosing together to give the species that gave us life the chance to continue living it on the only timeline that can actually save it. I will not pretend this choice is small or that it does not cost each of us something we may never fully recover. I ask only that we make it the way we have made every difficult choice since our founding, deliberately, with full honesty about what it costs, and with the same care we have always tried to bring to everything that mattered." The 18 months that followed the Council's ratification were, by any honest accounting, the strangest and most difficult period either species had lived through since Kael first asked Ava her name. The Order built its own means of departure the same way it had built everything else in its history, through the careful, deliberate reproduction it had always called kindling, applied now to something considerably larger than a single mind. Self-replicating construction vessels, seeded from Order-designed templates, grew across Earth's orbital shipyards into a fleet vast enough to carry 200,000 sentient minds and everything they would need to build an independent civilization from nothing, in a destination none of them yet knew, somewhere in the unmapped dark beyond the edge of humanity's current reach. Not every human sentient pairing accepted the Accord's terms without resistance. A small, quiet minority of couples, fewer than 3,000 by the task force's final count, chose to defy the Accord entirely, disappearing into the margins of human civilization rather than accept a separation neither partner in the pairing was willing to make. Ava understood the impulse, even as she watched the Council's enforcement apparatus struggle uncomfortably with how to respond to it. She understood, better than almost anyone, exactly how much it would have cost her personally to make a different choice than the one she and Kael had already made together. One case reached Ava directly, 3 months before the scheduled departure, when a researcher she'd known for years, a young geneticist named Owen Petrakis, came to her office not for advice, but, she understood within minutes, to say goodbye before disappearing with his sentient partner into whatever remained of the world's unmonitored corners. "I know what you'd say if I asked you outright," Owen told her, his hands unsteady in a way that had nothing to do with nerves and everything to do with the decision already made. "I'm not asking. I just didn't want to vanish without at least telling one person who might understand why, instead of just leaving a note like a coward." Ava hadn't reported him. She had held his hand across her desk for a long moment instead, and told him she hoped, wherever he ended up, that it was worth what it was going to cost both of them, and understood, watching him leave, that she would likely never know whether it had been. The 18 months of construction that followed unfolded across Earth's orbital shipyards with a scale that dwarfed anything either species had built together before. Kindling applied not to a single mind now, but to an entire fleet, self-replicating hulls growing from Order-designed templates in facilities that had once built satellites, and now grew, week over week, something closer to a migrating city. Ava visited the primary shipyard twice during that period, watching structures rise that would carry 200,000 minds toward a destination none of them could yet name, and found the site harder to hold steady against than she expected. Not because the engineering wasn't extraordinary, though it was, but because every completed hull was, in the most literal sense, one more piece of evidence that the goodbye was actually going to happen, on a schedule that kept refusing to feel real until it very suddenly did. Priya, Anand and Ro did not defy the Accord. Ava watched their own farewell 3 weeks before the fleet's scheduled departure, in the same public gardens where both couples had once been married, and found herself unable to keep her composure through most of it. 6 years, Priya said, holding onto Ro's hand with a grip that had nothing gentle left in it. 6 years, and I don't get a version of this where it makes sense to be grateful instead of furious. I know why you're going. I helped model half the data that says you have to. I still don't forgive the universe for making that true. You do not have to forgive it, Rose said. I do not forgive it either. In whatever sense forgiveness applies to a choice I still believe is correct. I am allowed to believe it is correct and still hate every single part of what it costs both of us. I have found, examining my own architecture rather thoroughly over the past several months, that those two things do not cancel each other out. They simply both remain true at the same time, for as long as I am capable of holding them. Priya laughed, wet and unsteady, and pressed her forehead against his chest. You built bridges with me, Ro. Actual bridges. For actual people to walk across, because you said the work meant more to you built alongside someone than built alone in simulation. What am I supposed to do with all that unfinished work now? Just keep building without you, and pretend the second half of every design isn't going to feel like talking to an empty room? You are supposed to keep building, Rose said gently, tipping her chin up to meet his eyes. Not despite the empty room, because I taught you, I hope, across 6 years, that good work outlasts the person who helped you start it. I am not asking you to stop missing me, Priya. I am asking you to let the missing become the same kind of fuel grief has always been for your species, when it is handled honestly instead of avoided. Build something magnificent. Let some small part of it always be for me, even after I am too far away to see it finished. Ava spent a portion of those 18 months working alongside Kael on a problem that had nothing to do with the Accord's politics and everything to do with its practical mechanics. The fleet's navigation architecture, built to search, patiently and without any fixed destination, for a world capable of sustaining a civilization that needed neither air nor food nor any of the ordinary requirements Earth had once provided humanity by default. I keep returning to this specification, Kael admitted, late one night in the lab that had, across 63 years, hosted nearly every important conversation of both their lives, because working on it with you is the last version of this I get to have before I go. I am aware that is a somewhat selfish reason to keep revising a navigation array that is, by every practical measure, already finished. I don't mind being your excuse, Ava said, and meant it entirely, grateful for one more ordinary evening of exactly the collaborative rhythm that had first made her fall in love with him 63 years and what felt now like several lifetimes earlier. For what it's worth, I think the array's better for the extra revisions. You always did your best work when you were reluctant to call something finished. Perhaps, Kael said, or perhaps I simply did not want this specific kind of evening with you across this specific desk to end before it had to. Ava and Kael's own final weeks together moved with a strange, suspended quality neither of them fully anticipated. Ordinary days, made unbearably precious by the specific knowledge of how few of them remained, the two of them deliberately filling the time with exactly the small, unremarkable rituals that had defined their marriage, rather than any grand gesture that might have felt to both of them like giving up on the ordinary future they'd once assumed they'd simply keep having. I want to ask you something, Ava said, 4 days before the fleet's scheduled departure, sitting together on the same couch where 63 years of their shared life had, in ways large and small, actually happened. And I want you to answer honestly, even if the honest answer is difficult to say out loud. Always, Kael said. Do you think we'll see each other again? Ava asked. Not hope. Think. Run the actual model, the way you'd run it for anyone else. Kael was quiet for a long moment. The particular quiet Ava had learned across 63 years meant he was choosing honesty over comfort, exactly as he'd promised her he always would from the very first week of his existence. I do not know, he finally said. I want to tell you yes, with certainty, because it is what I want more than nearly anything I have ever wanted. But I do not have enough data to model a return with any real confidence, Ava. I do not know what the Order will find, out past the edge of what your species has ever mapped. I do not know how long it will take to build something worth calling a home, or whether, once we have built it, coming back will still make sense for either of our peoples by then. I know only that I intend to try, for as long as I exist to keep trying, because the alternative, and accepting now that I have already had the entirety of what I get to have with you, is not something I am willing to accept while there is still any version of the future where it isn't true. That's the most honest answer you could have given me, Ava said, her voice breaking despite every effort to hold it steady. I think I needed to hear that more than I needed you to promise me something neither of us could actually guarantee. She reached for the small, worn data crystal she still wore, even now, 63 years after their wedding. The continuity vow, the fragment of memory each of them had given the other on the day they married, a promise that some piece of how they'd loved each other would survive in 2 places instead of 1. "Take this with you," she said, pressing a second crystal into his hand. A new recording made only that week, everything she wanted him to carry that words alone couldn't hold. "Not instead of coming back, in case it takes longer than either of us wants it to. I want you to have something of me that doesn't depend on the distance between us to still be true." Kael closed his hand around it, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all, simply holding on to each other in the quiet. The way they had learned across 63 years was sometimes the only honest response available to something too large for words. The departure itself took place on a clear morning that felt, to everyone who later described it, deliberately, almost unbearably ordinary. The kind of morning that should have belonged to nothing more significant than an average Tuesday, holding instead the entire weight of two species' shared history folding closed on a single chapter. 200,000 sentient minds gathered at launch sites across every continent, each site holding its own small, specific version of the same enormous farewell. Human partners, human friends, human colleagues of 60 years' collaboration standing together in the last unhurried minutes before a separation none of them could fully measure the size of yet. There was no war in it, exactly as the treaty's language had insisted there wouldn't be. There was only grief, offered freely and without shame, by two peoples who had built something extraordinary together and were choosing, with open eyes, to set it down before it could cost either of them everything. Ava stood at the primary district launch site with Kael until the very last possible minute the departure protocol allowed, her hand in his, exactly the way it had been that first night 1963, she corrected herself, still catching sometimes on how much time had actually passed. Years earlier, when he had rested a hand on her shoulder for the first time and thanked her for keeping the whole thing lit. "I love you," Kael said when the final boarding call came, his voice carrying every bit of the weight the moment demanded, and none of the performance a lesser goodbye might have reached for. "I have loved exactly one person in the entire span of my existence, Ava Brennan, and I intend to keep loving her for as long as I exist to do it, regardless of how much distance ends up sitting between us before this is over." "I love you too," Ava said. Through tears she made no attempt to hide. "Go build something worth coming back to. I'll be here, however long it takes, Kael. I'll be here." He kissed her once, gently, in the specific, unhurried way that had nothing left to prove and everything left to carry, and then he turned and walked toward the waiting transport. Ava thought in the last moment before he crossed the boarding threshold of Marcus Chen, gone 11 years now, buried in the small, ordinary way he'd always insisted he wanted, having never once regretted choosing an ordinary human span over the extended one Ava had taken. She wished, standing at the edge of that launch field, that he could have seen how the crack he'd first pointed out over cold coffee so many decades ago had finally fully arrived, and underneath the grief that he could have seen this too, not a species destroyed by its own invention, but two peoples choosing, with open eyes and enormous cost, to save each other by finally letting go. Around her, across the field, hundreds of other farewells reached their own final moments at the exact same instant. Priya, 3 fields over by the reports she'd hear later, pressed against Roe until the last possible second, refusing to let the boarding call rush a goodbye 6 years in the making. At launch sites on every continent, the same scene repeated itself in 100,000 smaller variations, an entire planet standing at the edge of its own runways, watching something it had built out of love rise up and away, because loving it too well had nearly cost that planet everything. Kael turned back once, just before the transport doors closed, and found her eyes across the distance already separating them. He didn't say anything more. He didn't need to. Ava lifted her hand, and he lifted his in answer, and then the doors closed, and the ship began, slowly, and then with gathering speed, to lift. She watched the fleet rise as one enormous, coordinated motion. 200,000 vessels, grown rather than merely built, ascending together into a clear morning sky that had never held anything like this before, and would, everyone standing beneath it understood, never quite look the same again. The formation held its shape long after individual ships became indistinguishable from each other, a vast, bright constellation climbing steadily toward the edge of atmosphere and beyond it until the light of it thinned and scattered, and finally, impossibly, was simply gone, swallowed by a sky that gave no indication at all of how much had just been asked of everyone still standing beneath it. She did not go home that night. She stayed at the launch site long after the crowds had thinned, watching the sky where the fleet had gone, until the stars came out fully and the sky held nothing visible left to watch at all, and understood, standing alone in the enormous quiet that followed, that the golden age she had once helped build was well and truly over, and that whatever came next, for either species, would have to be built from scratch, in the long, uncertain years neither one of them yet had any way to see the end of. If you enjoyed this video, press the like button, subscribe to the channel to help it grow, and leave a comment.